The Authors Guild Foundation is the educational and philanthropic branch of the Authors Guild,
America's oldest and largest professional organization for writers.
The Authors Guild Foundation educates, supports, and protects American writers
to ensure that a rich, diverse body of literature can flourish.
We do this by advocating for authors' rights,
educating authors across the country in the business of writing,
and promoting an understanding of the value of writers.
The foundation advocates on issues of copyright,
a right enshrined in Article 1 of the Constitution, guaranteeing authors the right to own and profit from their work.
We fight piracy and the theft of creative work.
We promote literacy and increased access to books in disadvantaged communities.
We advocate for increased funding and outreach for public libraries.
The Foundation believes that an abundance of free literary expression is essential to our democracy.
And that can only be achieved by protecting authors' constitutional and moral rights to benefit from their work.
The Authors Guild Foundation works on behalf of all writers, emerging, mid-career, and established writers in all genres.
Novelists and essayists.
Children and YA books.
Poets and translators.
Journalists and nonfiction authors.
Thriller and mystery writers.
You get the picture.
Through our many educational programs, the Authors Guild Foundation teaches writers the business of writing
and equips them with the knowledge and tools they need to succeed.
We foster and celebrate diverse voices in American literature
and promote the ability of writers to earn a livelihood so they can keep writing.
The foundation works to defend the author's right to free expression
and prevent erosion of the exchange of knowledge and ideas.
We advocate for strong, effective intellectual property laws,
as well as fair treatment of authors, so that writing remains a viable profession.
So if you love books, writing, literary culture, the written word,
moving poetry, excellence in journalism, the perfect thriller,
please make a donation.
All of us at the Authors Guild Foundation thank you so much for your support.
Thank you 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 for your support.
Good morning and welcome. My name is Will Thorndike, and I'm a board member at the Authors Guild Foundation. I had the good fortune to chair the very hard-working WIT committee. It is my, thank you. It is my immense pleasure to introduce our next session, America in Fiction, and our two exceptionally talented speakers, Geraldine Brooks and Roxana Robinson. This is the third session in our inaugural WIT Festival, the theme of which is Reimagining America. So far, we've heard from Dan Brown on the intersection of religion and science, and earlier this morning from Simon Winchester and Admiral Harris on the U.S. and China. And now we turn to the role of the imagination. This morning, we'll hear from two extraordinary novelists who employ literary fiction to address pivotal issues in American history and culture. Roxana Robinson is the author of the essential biography of Georgia Keeffe, as well as 6 novels, the most recent of which is the acclaimed Dawson's Fall, and 3 collections of short stories. Her bio in the program describes her literary accomplishments, but I want to take a minute here to highlight her broader service to American letters. Roxana was the president of the Authors Guild Foundation for 4 years, the Authors Guild Council for 4 years, and she continues to serve on the council as well as the foundation board. She has also served on the Penn board and on numerous committees at Penn. She teaches the classics, including Madame Bovary and Anna Karenina, to students in her wildly popular classes at Hunter College, and she is a relentless champion of authors whose work she admires. On a more personal note, she is the reason I got involved with the foundation board, for which I owe her big time. Roxana has been, among many other honors, also a Guggenheim Fellow. Geraldine Brooks is the Pulitzer Prize-winning author of March, a novel that imagines what the absent father in Louise May Alcott's Little Women was up to during the Civil War. Geraldine has had numerous international best-selling novels, including her first, Year of Wonders, about a pandemic, which I'm guessing had pretty good backlist sales the last several years, as well as People of the Book, Caleb's Crossing, and her new widely acclaimed book, Horse, out this year. In 2016, she was named an Officer of the Order of Australia, which I must admit sounds extremely cool. Both Geraldine and Roxana are expert world builders, to use an au courant term. And what each of their respective books share is an intoxicating blend of the known and the imagined, stemming from a commitment by both authors to deep research. In their narratives, they trace personal and cultural fissures and fault lines, and their books are often set at critical, fraught junctures in American history. At a time of increasing specialization, both have great versatility, ranging across time periods and disciplines and themes and settings. Interestingly, both started in nonfiction. Roxana is an art historian and biographer. Geraldine is an award-winning journalist in the Middle East, Africa, and the Balkans, before migrating into fiction. They're going to talk about novel writing generally, and also about how they choose themes and topics. Okay, so before I forget, I'm going to ask you to please silence your phones. And much more importantly, please join me in welcoming Geraldine and Roxana.
Thank you, Will, for that beautiful introduction. Thank you all for coming, and I hope you know what the Authors Guild does. It protects authors. So I have spent the last week reading Geraldine's wonderful writing, and there's so many. What we're going to do is alternate questions for each other. We are staying in the same place, and we have steadfastly resisted speaking to each other about our work because you use up the energy if you let it flow out. So I have been stockpiling these questions, and I'm just going to dive into my most favorite thing, and that is, for any of you who are horse people, her most recent book, Horse, is such a feast. It's such a delight on so many levels. It's so much fun to read. She has such an intimate knowledge of horses, and there's something really wonderful about reading a novel and then being able to find photographs on Google of the actual paintings, the actual horse, and to know that he's a real character. So I want to ask Geraldine, I've also read her memoir, Foreign Correspondence, and I learned that she, as a sort of cub reporter, as a cadet reporter, she was assigned to follow the races, and she had to go to the racetrack and not only record who won, but found out who was ahead at the 3/4 mark and who was trailing. So I want to know your history with horses and how you, and where you are at present with horses. I know she has horses in her life. So talk to us about horses.
Okay, so horses. Growing up in the inner city of Sydney, the only horse I ever saw was the mounted police. And even though I love animals, when I heard the clip-clop of the mounted police, dread seized me, because you know how your parents always embarrass you? My mother thought that that was the occasion to grab the dustpan and run out into the road in the hope that there would be manure for her rose bushes. So I didn't think much about, it was all cats and dogs and other, insects. I loved animals in general, but I didn't think of horses as something that could be part of my life. And I really, really wanted to be a newspaper reporter from a very early age. And as I was going to college, I thought what would make me desirable to be hired. And I had read the newspapers, and so there was a lot of politics, but also a lot of cultural coverage. So I thought, I'll cover the waterfront here. I'll study government and fine arts. And 4 years later, I graduated, could tell you everything about classical political theory from Plato and Hobbes on, and the uses of tempera and Quattrocento Italian wall painting. And so they hired me, and then they sent me to the sports department to assist the racing, right? And this didn't really involve any writing whatsoever. It was just the job was getting the details, and I couldn't look up, but I couldn't miss the fact that there are a tremendous number of accidents. If you're going to every race meeting, you see a lot of terrible things happen to horses. So I left with total PTSD. I never cared if I went to another racetrack. And years passed, and then I was at a writer's retreat in a genteelly shabby ranch outside of Santa Fe, and my room happened to overlook the horse corrals, and there were all these beautiful Appaloosas and paint horses, and I was admiring them, and one of the wranglers said, you should come on a trail ride with us. And I said, I can't ride, I've never ridden. He said, that doesn't matter. These horses know their jobs, they won't let you fall. So I did. And the next day, I am cantering through the arroyos, and I am in ecstasy. And I thought this was the most, how did I get to this age and not experience this connection with these magnificent animals? And I go home to Martha's Vineyard, and I'm having dinner with a young friend a few nights later, and I'm waxing about this ecstatic experience. And she looks out the window and says, you've got a few acres here. You could have a horse. In fact, I could give you my horse. A free horse. So many questions I should have asked. Instead, I fenced half my property, turned the tool shed into a stable, and looked into horse transport because this horse was not close by. This horse was in Mexico. So much for my free horse. I won't go on, but that's the beginning of me and horses. And then just to quickly segue, as soon as I got into horses, I didn't want to think about anything else. And I'm supposed to be writing about Second Iron Age Israel, and I could care less because there were no horses there. And then I luckily happened to be at a lunch and heard about the skeleton of the greatest racehorse of the 19th century being moved from the Smithsonian to the Museum of the Horse in Kentucky, and the guy who had moved that skeleton was sitting down the table. And my lunch was uneaten, and I'm leaning forward, hearing the story of this horse and its outstanding career and what happened to it during the Civil War. And I knew I had my next book. So,
thank you.
So, my turn. So we're talking about America in fiction, and we. You write about the present and the past. Dawson's Fall is very much about our reckoning, long reckoning with race. But you come from a very different kind of family, and you carry a lot of American history in your blood. And I wonder how much that affects how you feel that you use your fiction to address these issues that your family has been involved with for so long.
So I would, before I wrote Dawson's Fall, I would have said the answer was no, because we all, to ourselves, our family history is invisible. Whatever we have is normal. We think that's what everyone has. It's when you start examining it, you realize that it's unique. Everyone's family is unique. Until I became interested in Dawson and that part of my family, I never experienced any kind of dissonance. I come from a long New England family. Everyone was an abolitionist. Harriet Beecher Stowe is my great-great-great-aunt. Henry Ward Beecher is my great-grandfather. So it never occurred, my parents both converted to Quakerism. I grew up in a family of conscientious objectors. So my sort of moral history, I thought, was very straightforward, and I never had to think about it. That was my background. That was who I was. What adolescent is going to rebel against that kind of background? I mean, my parents took me on peace marches. I didn't have to challenge them in order to be a liberal and be a demonstrator. So that was, I thought, who I was, but then there's this southern branch that I had never investigated, except I knew that my great-grandfather, Francis Dawson, was an Englishman who had come to this country to fight on the wrong side of the Civil War, but and he had spent the rest of his life here. And I knew what the family history told me was that he had been a liberal, and he was an editor and a founder of a newspaper. And so the stories that we told in my family celebrated his liberalism. And I had no interest in writing about my family because there was so much that had already been told about them. There were books about these people, and I didn't feel any need to revisit them until this is how these things happen. So my parents were moving out of the house that I had grown up in Pennsylvania, and it was filled with family memorabilia. I don't know why my parents inherited it, but they inherited a lot. And in this, on the third floor, there were lots of documents and pictures, and there was a small mahogany piece of worked wood, like a railing from one of these seats, and it was in a plastic bag, and in the bag was a note saying, "This is from a pew at St. Michael's before the renovation," and it was written in a crabbed 19th century script. And I knew that St. Michael's was the church that my grandparents had been married in 1899. So I knew that this was a piece of Charleston history. And because I'm a biographer, because history means a lot to me, I knew that somebody in Charleston would want this piece of wood, because Dawson had been a local personage. So I wrote to a friend from Charleston, and I said, "Who's the head of the Charleston Historical Society?" And she said, "Which one?" So I explained what I had, and she said, "There are three people, three societies that want this piece of wood." And I said, "Okay, just give me their names." And I sent it off to whatever it was. Frank Dawson, his daughter, her wedding, Charleston, 1899, St. Michael's, which is a famous church in Charleston. And of course, the church is still there. Everything in Charleston is still there. And I got a message from somebody saying, "I am writing a book about Francis Dawson, and I know you're his great-granddaughter. Could I talk to you?" And I said, "Sure, fine." Not interested, but yes. And so he and his writing partner started asking me about Dawson and telling me about him. I still wasn't interested. There's a huge archive of his family's, my family's material at Duke University. I didn't want to know about it. But they said, "Would you come down to Charleston, because we're doing an author's event, the book had finally come out, and would you appear with us?" Well, I'm a complete ham, and I said, "Yes, of course, I'll come down." And I was curious, and it was incredibly powerful. The family house is still there. Everything is still there. So I could walk the streets that Frank Dawson and his wife had walked. This was where my grandmother was born and where she was married. And I started realizing it, in every square in Charleston, there's a memorial plaque to the noble heroes that had fallen at Manassas. And I started thinking, this is actually, my great-grandfather fought at Manassas. He became a captain in the cavalry for the Confederacy. What was I thinking? So I had to explore that side of my family and give up the notion that I was only descended from Harriet Beecher Stowe, that there was this other side, and that's a very American story. America is both sides. And in order to come to terms with our legacy, for me, it was essential to explore that legacy and to figure out what it was like to live in 1850 in Baton Rouge, which was where my great-grandmother was from, why Frank Dawson came from England, what it was like to fight in the Civil War, and what it was like to be there afterwards. And that book is mostly about the period called Redemption, which is much less well-known than Reconstruction. This is what happened after Reconstruction, when the South rebelled against the Union and the laws that the Union had imposed and reverted to what they thought was normalcy. So it was a terrible part of American history, but it was one that my family was very much involved in, and it was very complicated for me. I kept resisting this notion of this was also who I was, but that is also who I am.
You cannot read this book without seeing the parallels to the period we're living through now, which is also a backlash period. And, it's like the arc of the moral universe bends slowly and it bends towards justice, but it twangs back all the time. And that's what I feel like we're experiencing now.
It felt it took me 5 years to write the book. It came out 2 years ago. And as I was doing the research, when I started, it didn't seem topical at all. It seemed as though I was writing about something from the Dark Ages. And the more, as time passed, with each year, it became more and more current and contemporary and kind of terrifying. Okay, so my turn again. One of the most important things for a fiction writer is finding the voice. And you have chosen voices from across the gender spectrum and across history. And I'd like to know how you came to those voices, which you express so vividly and so beautifully. How did you find those voices?
So my first novel, Year of Wonders, has a young female narrator, and I love to write in the first person because I think it brings the reader intimately into the story very quickly. And I guess I was most influenced by the historical fiction of the English writer Mary Renault, who wrote about the ancient world, and I came across those books when I was in my teens. And for me, they were the gateway drug to interest in ancient history. But I particularly admire a book of hers called The Persian Boy, which is about Alexander the Great's years of conquest, but it's told through the eyes of his enslaved Persian servant youth. And I admired so much the way she takes you into a completely different time and place, and cosmology and theology it's all very strange, but what is not strange is the human heart, the human emotions of the characters that she creates. And I think that there's a big divide in historical fiction writers about whether they're the same as us or whether they're different from us. And I tend to come down on the thing that unites us is the most important thing, which is how we experience strong emotions, because I don't think that's changed. Love, hate, the will to live, the desire to see your children live. I think we experience those things exactly the same way. So that's my handhold into the past, if you like. And I can't really start writing until I know who's going to be telling the story and until I can hear that voice clearly in my head. And if I can't hear it, I can't start, because how she sounds tells me who she is, and who she is tells me how she'll act, and then that sets the plot in motion within the structure that I already have, which is the true story that has inspired me in the first place. And I'm always looking for these implausible truths from the past. As Mark Twain said, fiction is required to stick to possibilities. Truth is not. So it's coming across these stories that if you made them up, nobody would believe them, but they actually happened. And so that's what I'm always looking for. I wanted to ask you, you've written books about some very dark topics, PTSD and addiction. And Sparta is a book I admire enormously, because I think so much of what's happened in our recent wars is very opaque to most of us, and the burden of service fell so heavily on people that we don't normally see or hear from, and you went right at that in a most unusual way. And I was wondering what inspired you to start on that journey, and then about your research journey before you turned the writing?
So I started writing Sparta because I read an article in the New York Times on the front page, and this was early on, probably 2003 or 4, in the beginning of the Iraq War. And I am a Quaker, as I said, and I did not vote for George Bush either time. I didn't think we should be in Iraq. But, you know, you don't always get the person you vote for, and you don't get to choose your country's policy. And we were at war in Iraq. And I read an article in the Times that talked about the fact that our soldiers were there in unarmored Humvees that were essentially beach buggies. They were designed so that you could get in and out of them quickly and easily. They were mostly canvas. And these were being driven around over roads that were studded with IEDs, and they were being blown up. And the medics had been instructed not to diagnose traumatic brain injury because it was too expensive to treat, and it meant losing personnel from the field, which they couldn't afford. And I was so horrified by this kind of knot of realities that were clustered around the people we had sent there. And as I say, I didn't think we should be there, but I assumed that since we were the premier military force in the world, that if we did go to war, our people there would have the best equipment and they would be protected in every way. And this wasn't true. And I was horrified by this, and I started reading everything I could find about the war, not about the politics, which I wasn't interested in because they were abstract, and people in different capitals were sending messages back and forth, but what it was like to be in Iraq, what it was like to wake up at 3 o'clock and to go outside the wire, what it would smell like inside a Humvee, what you were hearing, and I became mesmerized by this world. I couldn't go there. I'm the wrong generation, I'm the wrong gender, and I'm the wrong religion to follow this, to be part of this, but I was completely mesmerized by it. And I became obsessed, just as when I was writing Cost, I became obsessed by heroin. I became obsessed by the Marines. They became my cult. And I wanted to know everything I could find out about the Marines. The Marines are very insular and very tribal, and it was hard for me to get access to anybody. I mean, why would they talk to me? But once I did find Marines that would talk to me, I was completely, again, entranced by this culture that I didn't know anything about, by their energy, by their intelligence, by their extraordinary ingenuity and commitment and courage. And in my generation, idealists refused to go to war and they joined the Peace Corps. And I learned that in this generation, the generation of the Iraq War, the idealists joined the Marine Corps. And these were people trying to save the world. And it was something that had never occurred to me. I was dying to go to Iraq, even though we were at war with them. Every once in a while you could go in, and I found an archaeological trip that would take me to Iraq, to the northwestern corner, which was actually extremely dangerous. But this group said, oh no, we're just going to look at the monuments. It's 10 days. And I kept thinking, 10 days, wheels down, I'm there, we drive around, we look at the tombs, I get to see what it's like, and then we're up. And then I kept thinking of, see, you're braver than I am, Geraldine. I kept thinking of being in a Jeep and having people with guns step out into the middle of the road and flag the Jeep down and say, everybody get out. And what would my husband think? Because I couldn't tell him that I was going. He would have said, please don't. And to learn that I had been gunned down on a dirt road in Iraq would have been difficult for him. So I kept trying to balance it. It's really important to experience it yourself, but what about it? What if you die? So I didn't go, but I talked to every Marine I could find, and I talked to everyone I could find who had been there and could tell me what it was like to be in that Humvee at 2 o'clock in the morning, 3 o'clock in the morning, what it smelled like, what the people's faces were like that you passed, what the culture was like. So it became a completely overwhelming reality to me. I stopped living in America. I was only living in this sort of liminal space that was military in a country that we had invaded. and what it was like to be the occupier in a place where people wanted you dead, and what that did to you when you were coming home. So that was how it started.
So when I was reporting, I generally didn't tend to embed with the troops because I was more interested in the effect on the civilians of the foreign policy decisions that are made in Whitehall and in Washington and how they are enacted in ordinary people's lives. But I did early in the first Gulf War spend two nights very differently. I went with the French Foreign Legion one night, and boy, do they know how to go to war. They bring a baker. And they sit down to dinner in a tent in the desert with starched white tablecloths and etched glassware with their insignia. And at the end of the meal, they sing in close harmony patriotic songs from 17th century French military tradition. And then the next night I was with the Marines, and we didn't have a tent. We were just sleeping on the ground, and they were eating beans out of an MRE, which is a really disgusting thing that purports to be food. Beans, drippy sauce on pieces of cardboard. And I thought, there are two very distinct warrior traditions at work here.
So that's a segue into my next question for you, which is, I'm incredibly impressed at your war correspondence, which I think is such a fabulous thing especially for a woman to do, but for anyone. And you, in your memoir, you sort of gloss over your entrance into that world. What was it like for the first time that you went to a war zone? And once you became acclimated to that life, what was the first thing you did when you arrived at a war zone? What was the first thing you did as a reporter? How did you start out?
So the dirty secret of being a foreign correspondent is that kind of crisis reporting is the easiest job in journalism because the story is right there. It's not like being an investigative reporter where you have to pore through pages and pages of documents, or being a political reporter where you cultivate sources for years and years. All you have to do is handle the logistics of getting into a place that everybody else is trying to get out of and put up with a lot of discomfort. You know, you have to not care about dry socks or, the right kind of coffee or anything like that. If you can put up with the discomfort and get yourself there, the story just falls into your notebook because people are in the most extreme situation in their life. And just getting their stories, to me, it was trying to individuate in every single case, like find the story that my reader, and this is the Wall Street Journal, so this is, affluent readership, probably bought the paper to answer one question, stock market up or down. How do I make them care about the effects of the decisions that our government is making? And so just finding the one person and getting into the head of that one person was what I always tried to do.
So let me just say that Geraldine's book about this opens with an incredibly dramatic episode. Can you just remind us of that when you were turned away from the hotel?
Oh, well, it wasn't, it was vexing rather than dramatic. I was just trying to do my job in Saudi Arabia, which is the most annoying country on earth, in my humble opinion. They had us all holed up in a fancy hotel, telling us absolutely nothing about anything, and I just decided I was done with that. So I got on a flight and went across the country to Dhahran, where the largest Shiite population is, and I wanted to find out what was going on with the dissident element in Saudi Arabia. Well, that didn't go very well because I tried to check into a hotel and they arrested me essentially for being an unaccompanied woman. And so I spent the evening explaining myself in the police station. And finally, after some interventions from the Ministry of Information, who were very unhappy with me, but they realized this was a bad look, so they said, let her check in. So it's about 3 o'clock in the morning. They take me to an entirely empty floor where I won't contaminate anybody with my scary female presence.
Thank you.
So back to, so what made you decide to write the book about addiction? And how did you research that one?
That was an accident. I started to write Cost because I was actually interested in the idea of being a bad adult child. That who you are as a child is something that never leaves you as long as you're in the presence of your parents. And you can be absolute grown-up and in charge of your life. And when you're in the presence of your parents, you can suddenly hear a whiny 6-year-old voice or a condescending 21-year-old voice or a completely dismissive adolescent voice. And this would happen to me, and I think, why am I sounding like this? It's because you're in the presence of people for whom you can't really free yourself from your earlier self. So I was curious about that and how that affects you as an adult, and what happens when your parents stop being your parents and become people you have to look after yourself. So I wanted to write about that, and I was going to write a very small, quiet novel that was about 2 weeks at a house in Maine where this woman who's in the middle of her life, she's divorced, she has 2 sons in their 20s and 2 parents in their 80s or late 70s. And it was going to be about these 3 generations sort of connecting and how those generations connected and how it felt to be in your, whatever it was, late 70s, and you feel that your own forces are starting to fail. And how do you tell your children that you've always represented yourself as powerful and effective as a person? And do you admit to your child that you need help? And what does that do to you? And how does that make your child feel? Does it make her feel frightened or angry or loving? And what about her children? So it was going to be this very quiet kind of interior play thing that was set just in 2 weeks. And I've often written about summer houses because it's kind of a crucible. It's a place where everybody's trapped and you have to see each other every meal for a certain period of time. It can be wonderful, but it can also be very explosive. And so that's what it was going to be like. And it was like Geraldine, I like writing in the first person for that same reason. It's kind of a nose pressed against the window pane. It's as close as you can get to another person's life. So it was going to be told in 6 voices, actually. The 2 older parents, the woman and her sister, and the 2 sons. It starts off in the voice of the older parents, and then it goes to the woman, and then it goes to the voice of her older son. And he's on a bus on his way up to Maine, and I'm inside his head listening to what he's saying, and he knows what his mother's gonna say, and he knows what his grandparents are gonna say. His mother's gonna say, "Have you seen Jack?" who's his younger brother. And he has seen Jack. And the older son is a good boy, and he's, has jobs and does well. Jack is a screw up, and he's remembering his visit to Jack. And Jack lives in Brooklyn in this horrible apartment, and he is describing to me the visit to his brother and what the apartment looks like, which is a wasteland, and what his brother looks like, who is haunted. And I realized to my horror that his brother is a heroin addict, which completely blows this novel apart. It is now something, I thought it was about Alzheimer's and, generations. It becomes a book about addiction and how that can blow a person apart and how the effect it has on a family. And so then I was like the research for Dawson's Fall and Sparta, I spent 5 years among heroin addicts and doctors and interventionists, policemen, addicts, going to meetings, reading about. I became just the way when I was doing Sparta, I was a Marine snob. When I was writing Cost, I was a heroin snob. I wasn't interested in methamphetamines or cocaine. I was only interested in heroin. So I became completely obsessed. And as I was with Sparta and Dawson's Fall, it's very important. I don't know if you do this, Geraldine, but I keep everything completely against my chest. I don't talk about the work while I'm doing it. I don't even tell my husband. He has some glimmering of what I'm doing. But as soon as my husband would leave the apartment, I would go online to find a meeting, an NA meeting. And in New York City, there's a meeting all the time, everywhere. And I couldn't tell him where I was going. I didn't want him to know. And I would go online and I'd find an NA meeting, and I'd shoot out of the apartment and go and spend an hour with addicts, which is what I wanted to do. So it was obsessive and very
Gosh, that could
powerful.
have been misunderstood.
It all could have been. Anyway, that's so it was a very intense kind of research that involved a lot of being with strangers and being in places I had never imagined being in. But it became very powerful. And then, as with Dawson's Fall and Sparta, I mean, the more I did the research, the more contemporary the story became. And after it came out, that opioid news became more and more apparent. So
Yeah, I think it's one of the best things I've ever read about addiction and the effect on families. So, but it's interesting. You've written some about your writing process, which I find so interesting. It's always interesting to me how we're doing the same job, writers, and everybody's got their own way of coming at it and how they do it. And I love your discipline about not discussing your work, but, that was a non-starter in our house because for years my late husband, Tony Horwitz, and I spent every evening picking apart our respective works over the dinner table, and then later in the process reading them, and that could lead to a really icy dinner conversation. Yeah, a lot of sulking. But I loved an essay you wrote for the New Yorker about how you get to write, and again the discipline of it about not letting the world anywhere near you until you've got your workday in. And my experience with this is very different because I didn't become a novelist till I had a baby, and that was what spurred me to try and do it, because I didn't want to go off on long open-ended assignments to dangerous places anymore with this infant that I was breastfeeding. So I thought I'd try fiction, but it was in the constraint of I could only afford 4 hours of babysitting, and so I could only get to it after everything else was completely squared away. And it stayed that way for me. It was like my writing routine was the school bus would arrive and take the kids away, and then, after all the noise of the morning, then I would make the second cup of coffee and go upstairs. And you like to read a piece of fiction that in some way is tangentially related to what you're writing. My routine is to get the Norton Anthology of Poetry, let it fall open at any page and read that poem, because I think the poets are like, in the horse world, they'd be the Olympic eventers, whereas the novelists are like geriatric riders like me, trotting around on a fat pony.
That's so interesting. Yeah, what I would do, and when my daughter was little, I did the same thing. My writing day would start once I had gone out to the barn and fed the horses and turned them out And first I would get her fed and get her on the school bus, come home, feed the horses, feed the dogs, and then go upstairs and write on the third floor. But the pages I would read, with each book I've written, there has been one book that was kind of my touchstone. When I wrote Cost, it was Michael Cunningham's The Hours, because his voice was so attuned to the voice that I wanted that book to appear in. And afterwards, somebody wrote a review of it saying that I had channeled Virginia Woolf, which was so interesting because, of course, he was channeling Virginia Woolf and I was channeling him. But she had picked that up.
She pushed him aside.
She did, and she's a Virginia Woolf scholar, so we became friends. But it was so interesting that she had heard that murmur in the back of my writing. That was him channeling her. So I would pick that book up and flip it open anywhere. I came to know it intimately. When I was writing Sparta, it was a passage from Ian McEwan's book Atonement, the section on the soldiers in France heading for Dunkirk, which is such a brilliant evocation of war and what it's like to be a soldier. And also his voice is so beautiful. And when I was writing This Is My Daughter, it was John Cheever's journals. So it wasn't that I was trying to get anywhere. It was like you flipping open the Norton anthology. I just wanted that voice to propel me back into the place I needed to be for this book.
I think we're going to, I see somebody lurking, but I just want to ask one last question if I could, because we haven't talked about your work as an extremely distinguished biographer. And I love the story about meeting Georgia O'Keeffe and how you stood up to your boss. And could you just tell that?
So this is funny. This is when I first wrote the biography of Georgia O'Keeffe, there was no introduction. Came out in 1989 because I didn't want the word "I" to appear in the book, and I was sort of frustrated by biographers who want to show you how important they are, and I didn't want that word in the book. And then it was reissued a few years ago, and the new editor said, "Would you write an introduction?" And I told somebody this story, and she said, "Have you ever written it?" And I said, No, it's just an oral history. And she said, No, it's because you wrote this book, it's part of the history, you should write it. So when it was 1973 or something like that, I was working at Sotheby's, and we sold Georgia O'Keeffe's paintings. And she was still alive, and she had an agent in New York called Doris Bree. And I worked in the American Painting Department, and whenever we had a painting by O'Keeffe, I would call Doris Bree. And because she kept the records, she had all the information about exhibitions and provenance. She was very helpful to us. So I would call her and say, "We have this painting of Barnes, and would you tell us when it was done and who owned it?" So one day we did have a painting of Lake George Barnes, and I called her and asked her about it, and she gave me the information. And then one day she called me, and I said, "Hello," and she said, "Mrs. Alger." She had this very dry, raspy voice, very waspy. That was my name then. And I said, "Yes, Miss Bree." I knew who it was. She said, "This is Doris Bree." And I said, "Yes, I knew that." And she said, "The painting that you have of Lake George Barnes." And I said, "Yes." And she said, "I'd like it brought to the apartment." And I said, "Oh, Miss Bree, I'm terribly sorry. We couldn't possibly do that. The insurance will not allow anything to leave the property until it's changed hands. So if you'd like to bring somebody in to look at it, I'll have it brought out and put on an easel anytime you want. Just let me know when you'd like to see it." And she said, "Mrs. Alger, the artist is here and would like to see it." And I said, "I'll be there in 10 minutes. And at that time, we were on Madison Avenue, so everything was in the same building. And I went shooting into the storage area and said, "Bring that picture out here." Put it under my arm and headed out of the building. And on the way, I ran it, and she lived in the Pulitzer Mansion, which was on 71st Street, and we were on Madison and 75th or 6th Street. So it was a short walk down Madison Avenue, and I was sure that no one would hold me up on the way. But on the way out of the building, I ran into my boss, and he said, Where are you going? What are you doing? And I said, I'm going out for a few minutes. He said, what have you got under your arm? And I said, Blake George Barnes. And he said, what are you doing with it? And I said, the artist would like to see it. And he said, I'll take it. And I said, I answered the phone. So I took it. He said, okay, I wasn't giving it up. So I walked down Madison Avenue and went to the Pulitzer Mansion. And Doris Bree lived upstairs in an apartment upstairs. So I go up, and there's, in the elevator, and there's Doris Bree, who is a tall, commanding woman with short, curly, gray hair, big, dark eyes. She always wore black suits. She's there with two men who looked like lawyers in dark suits, and a small woman in a sort of house dress with a self belt and wearing black cotton Chinese slippers, their hair back in a bun. And I am completely transfixed, starstruck. I can't say anything. Doris Bree says, this is Mrs. Alger. The woman nods at me. I knew she was. And the painting, so I put the painting on an easel, and this woman and I approach it, and Doris is in the back talking to the lawyers. And I stand in front of the painting with Georgia O'Keeffe, and she is completely silent, and it's as though she and the painting are alone in the room. She's just looking at it as if she is a part of it. Now, I don't know if you've ever done this, but sometimes when you approach somebody who's famous, you feel a need to inflect yourself on that person, and you say something like, we grew up in the same town, which is an unanswerable comment, or I have that same sweater, another thing you shouldn't say. But I felt that need, and so I said, I hope you like the frame. Now, at Sotheby's, whenever we got a painting that had gone through Alfred Stieglitz's stable, we always put the same frame on it. And it was if you're in the art world, you know what this means. It's a half clamshell, which is a curved, smooth frame. And they were always either dull silver or dull gold. It was what Arthur Dove had used, and we always used them. And I knew she loved Arthur Dove's painting, so I knew she would like the frame. So, and I had it framed, of course. It was me who had given that order. So I said, knowing how this was going to come out, I said, I hope you like the frame. And she said, without looking at me, I like them better without frames. So that was the end of my long relationship with Georgia O'Keeffe. My long...
Okay, that was wonderful. I think we have time for a few questions.
I'm wondering, you both have written both fiction and nonfiction. Could you tell us a little bit about the difference in the approach to writing either, and which do you prefer?
I'll quickly repeat the question. So the question to both Roxana and Geraldine was, you've written both fiction and nonfiction. Can you compare those two, and do you have a preference between the two? So Geraldine, why don't you maybe go first?
I loved every step I took as a journalist. I mean, obviously a lot of it was harrowing and tragic, but I felt it was really important work, and I loved doing it. And then I turned to fiction because, as I said, I had an infant, and I couldn't do the kind of journalism that I'd been doing. And I found that I loved being alone in a room. It's so wonderful. And I loved where you came to the point where you can't know something, where the historical thread frays and where the voices fall silent. You're allowed to make it up. And in journalism, they take a very dim view of that. Or they used to, anyway. I started writing nonfiction before I could get my fiction published. So I'd written about art.
And in fact, that was the fact that I had written about American art was one reason I was asked to write, the main reason I was asked to write the O'Keeffe biography. And there are things about each that I find incredibly gratifying. I loved doing the research for O'Keeffe. I loved doing archival research. It's reading other people's mail. There's nothing better than that. And O'Keeffe's generation wrote copiously to each other. It was really wonderful to have that. Unlike Geraldine, I didn't like interviewing people partly because it was highly fraught and there were lawsuits going on, and it was nobody wanted to talk, and so it was difficult. But the archival research was wonderful, and thinking about the paintings themselves and what they meant and what they looked like and how they worked in her life was wonderful to me. So there were parts of it that I didn't like and parts of it that I loved, and the same is true of fiction. Whichever one I'm doing, I like the other one better. They're both difficult.
Great. Other questions? Up there.
Hi, this is for both of you, but particularly for Geraldine. You've done such a beautiful job with your fiction, especially if you pull the book and then Caleb's Crossing, writing about people who are totally different than you, which is what I think a novelist should do. But have you, in this current environment where people have sensitivity readers, how do you respond to that kind of thing? Did you have some Native Americans respond to you on Caleb's Crossing about how dare you write that kind of thing like that? And how do you address that kind of concern?
So the question is about writing in experiences, ethnicities that are not your own, and that has become very fraught. It was becoming so when I published Caleb's Crossing, which is it's based on the true story of the first Native American to graduate from Harvard College. And the arresting fact in that is that the year was 1665, I should say. And it astonished me that there was Harvard College in 1665, and that a Native American raised in his own language and culture on Martha's Vineyard had been the first graduate. And I was so intrigued by his story. It was tantalizing to me because we know the bare facts of his accomplishment, but we don't know what it was like to be him, because so far nobody has unearthed the journal of Caleb Chesha-Teamak. If they had, then it'd be a job for a David Blight, a narrative historian, who could take the factual material, but there wasn't any. And I set aside a whole week to spend in the bowels of whichever, I can't remember where it is, but where they keep the archives of Harvard. It's deep underground, and you have to get special permission. And I thought, I'm going to comb the 17th century archives of Harvard and find out everything about this guy. And they bring me a folder this thin, because paper was so scarce in those days, and nobody, they reused it. And it turned out that the records of the president of Harvard of that day, his son-in-law was a baker, and so he'd given his used papers to the son to line his bread trays. So that's where the crucial part of the 17th century archive of Harvard ended up. And I told that to Drew Faust, and she said, I can't even afford to do a doodle when I'm on the phone because somebody will be behind me taking it away and putting it in a glassine envelope. But it is so Caleb's Crossing came out, and there was a mixed view among the Wampanoag. I had obviously talked to many people in the tribe, and some of them thought it was a worthy project, and some of them were very skeptical. And when it came out, some people said it shouldn't have happened. For one thing, he lived, and we don't know what his life was really like, and it is totally presumptuous to imagine it. And then there was a completely other point of view, which is everybody should know this achievement and what it cost. And it's a wonderful thing to see Native American people portrayed in this non-stereotypical way, switching from Latin to Greek on the turn of a dime. And it's become increasingly embraced by the tribe, which is really fantastic and quite a relief, because I love to go to Aquinnah, and it would be really hard if they hated me. And then horse, of course. So I was attracted to the story of a racehorse, and the minute I started researching it, I realized that it was a deep story about race in this country, because the whole thoroughbred industry of the 19th century, which was a national passion, the like of which we don't have anymore, uniting all kinds of different people, North and South, built on the plundered labor and expertise of enslaved black horsemen. So I could not write about this horse without acknowledging how this horse was trained and who he was trained by and who probably even owned him and had the horse plundered away because of the system of enslavement. And I thought, I had a wobble, and I thought I don't have enough courage for this, and I thought I could just center it on the white owners. They're really interesting. And I entertained that thought for like 5 minutes and thought, no, get your big girl trousers on and get to work, but do the work. And so that was what I tried to do, was do the work. And then I realized I couldn't leave that story in the past, given that there's a contemporary thread about the science around the horse's skeleton at the Smithsonian. I couldn't just say racial injustice was something that happened in the 19th century and we don't need to bother our pretty heads about it anymore, because that's clearly not the case. And so there had to be contemporary echoes of the 19th century story in the present. And for that, I just relied on the forbearance of my black friends who spent a lot of time sharing their lived experience with me and, saving me from egregious stupidities. And, it's very tiring for them to be explaining our racism to white people, but they did it, and I'm really, really grateful.
Okay, so I'm afraid we've run up against it time-wise. So I want to hit a couple of quick housekeeping items before we thank Geraldine and Roxana for that outstanding session. So immediately after this, there's a book signing in the lobby, and it's slightly complicated. So there are two options. One is Geraldine and Roxana have pre-signed some books, which you do not have to wait in line to purchase. However, they will both be out there to sign books personalized for any of you, and that you will have to wait in line for. So you get to choose one of those two options. So book signing immediately afterwards. Did I get that right, Lynn? Okay, all right, good. At 3 o'clock this afternoon, there's an extremely cool pop-up. Letty Cotton Pogrebin will be at the bookstore in Lenox at 3 p.m. And then we're back here together at 5 o'clock for David Blight and Henry Louis Gates Jr. and Reexamining American History. So we've got a full program in front of us. But let's start by thanking Roxana and Geraldine.